Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben, and I'm going to be your trainer to walk through SAP Concur Invoice today to do a little training session on some content around best practices, functions, and features. I have muted all lines, so if anybody is looking to ask questions, please feel free to put those in the chat. What I'll do is I'll stop the recording at the end of my presentation, and I'll go ahead and both field questions that are in chat and let people off mute so that if there are other questions around the content we've provided or anything else for that matter, that we can make sure to address that. So with that, I am at the concursolutions.com login screen. And here's where you enter your username. And I'm just going to go ahead and click next as I'm logging in as a test user within Concur. Once I sign in, each of you will be directed to the Concur landing page, where you'll be greeted by name in the top left. Additionally, you'll see some information along the top black bar. And if you click on this SAP Concur logo, it'll always bring you back to the home page. And then there are requests, so purchase requisitions, invoices. Some may see the App Center tab, as well as a help screen, which is a very nice thing to have that includes training and invoice help. Additionally, there's a link to drill into profile settings, and that's where we're going to start after covering the home page. So in Concur, we do prescribe to a work to zero concept. And whether you're a submitter of documents or an approver of documents, that's what the corresponding number of tiles that you'll see will essentially communicate the number of documents, in this case, purchase requests that are ready for submission, invoices that are ready to be submitted, etc. So I'm going to start with some best practices around our user profile settings, and how each of you will navigate there is profile and then the profile settings. Here on the left, you're going to see your information, such as personal or company, including email addresses, and I'll come to those in just a minute. The first piece I want to cover is invoice preferences. And this is where Concur, you can set Concur to deliver an automated email based on the access you have in Concur. A lot of people get a lot of email. So if you're in Concur working there frequently and you're going in pretty much every day, you may want to elect to inactivate some of these email settings. For me, I tend to be more of an infrequent user, so I do like to keep these on. So for example, send me an email when the status of one of my submitted invoices changes, when an invoice is awaiting my approval, when an invoice image is reviewed, etc. So one of the first things I recommend to right size the amount of email traffic coming in from Concur is that you come in here and then you just review your email settings. And that way you can opt out of any informational emails that you don't need. Secondly, in the images area, a lot of folks who tend to use Concur will work on multiple monitors, and that's what I do. And I actually prefer my images, i.e. the images of an invoice, be opened in a separate window so I can have the invoice image on one screen and the Concur user interface on another screen. Additionally, you can also select to automatically open that invoice image each time you open a new document within the Concur user interface. And that's designed to save you clicks, because 2 or 3 clicks over the course of a day or a week really do add up. So in addition to the invoice settings, some of you may have delegates who work on your behalf. This is where, if you select invoice delegates, temporarily you could assign a delegate to submit documents on your behalf if you're out of office. It's a very simple process where you would click Add Delegate, search by name, and then you can say, can they just prepare documents? Can they submit them? And do you want them to receive your emails? This, should be used judiciously and sparingly, but it's a great way if you have documents in your work queue to have others action them, because from time to time, we all want to take a little time away from the office. Similarly, there is a separate set of delegates for the purchase request module for those of you who do purchase requisition. One other key area of the user profile is email addresses. This is where you can actually register an email address and verify it, which will also help you when you're registering for Concur Mobile. Because I am in as a test user, that we're missing one piece at the bottom that says verify my email. And I do want to call that out, as that's just a limitation of the test user purple bar you're seeing across the top. By verifying your email address, it does ensure you're going to receive timely communications, and we do recommend each user do so. So lastly, Concur Mobile, in my world, is the greatest thing since sliced cheese, because, for example, you can approve invoices on the go. You can review different pieces of information around invoices. And if you're traveling between buildings, you can stay connected. What's important is that when you download the app, you just have a verified email address, and you can see here's a list right here of the we don't have this particular email address on file yet. And all you have to do is download Concur Mobile and sign in with your username and password. And it's extremely easy and does provide an additional service for those who want to have the Concur Mobile app available to them, especially for those who are approving invoices to ensure vendors are paid in a timely manner. It's really, truly invaluable. So this completes the best practices and the information you should know around the user profile. With that, I will just call out one other thing where you do have a change password link as well as a system settings link. And this just provides some basic information around how you want certain things to look in Concur. But with that, I'm going to click on the SAP Concur logo. That's going to take me back to the landing page. And I am going to begin with a non-PO associated invoice. So I have a couple of documents that went through Concur Invoice Capture, and hopefully each of you are aware of the dedicated invoice capture aliases for SLC, LVI, LPS, etc. Because by sending your electronic invoices there, Concur will scrape all the information off of the invoice so you don't have to do manual data entry into Concur. I'm going to select this Vantage invoice. And what you'll see is the layout of the Concur user interface is presenting important information around an invoice. First, you have vendor information, which you can view, which is read-only, but if you're looking for particular information around the vendor, it's certainly available to you. Additionally, there's going to be potential exception messages along the top, and I reprocessed an existing invoice, and this is a really important exception message, so I did leave it for our purposes. Concur does have a built-in duplicate invoice check based on the vendor and the invoice number. In this case, I'm going to update the invoice number to essentially clear this exception message. Now, this won't stop submission, but we certainly don't want to be paying vendors twice. And in the case, if this were the case, it's definitely merits some investigation, potentially looping in your Concur administrator to assist. So I'm just quickly, for our purposes, going to update the invoice number, and you'll see the exception message change and be cleared. It's important to note that yellow exception messages in Concur are soft stops. They're informational to help you know what to do correctly. Red exception messages, on the other hand, are hard stops, which need to be clear before you would be able to submit a document. So in terms of the fields that you have access to, a red bar along the left of that field will denote a required field. You will also see a number of read-only fields that are based on your field access rights and permissions. So we can see here that Concur pre-populated the invoice number. There wasn't a PO number. There's an invoice received date, an invoice date, a total amount, as well as a set of chart of accounts values that are modifiable so that the appropriate cost center can have this invoice hit their budget. So as I do this generally, I will also open up the View Invoice tab. And this is where you will see a pop-up of the invoice. And you can validate the header information such as the vendor, the invoice date, the invoice number, against what you see in the Concur user interface. Concur's OCR capture tool has an extremely high success rate in terms of accuracy, but we always want to do our due diligence to make sure things match up correctly. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and close it out, and I'm going to add a comment to say, I validated the information against the image. Comments are a very powerful tool. Where these stack up and actually become available to approvers and other individuals who will work this invoice, including those people in accounts payable. So for example, as I go through my actions and details drop down next, we'll come back to that comment I just made. So under the Actions tab, there are a few things to be aware of. The first is if you've been assigned an invoice and you don't know how to action it or there's an issue with it, you can unassign it and send it back to accounts payable. And when you do so, you will be prompted to add that said comment. Because if you're removing it from your work queue, accounts payable will need to understand why. Additionally, you can upload images. In certain instances with certain people, you can delete images and invoices. And then if you do need to, there is actually a print format where you can have a pop-up that summarizes the attributes of the invoice. This will take a little bit time to pop up. So for our purposes, I'm going to go ahead and close it in the interest of time. And then the last piece is if you're dealing with a utility, a recurring invoice, this is more of a 200 level class in Concur Invoice, but we do have recurring invoice functionality that can auto-generate invoices based on a particular period of time, such as X day of the month. In addition, you can review and add comments, review an audit trail, which this won't look glorious at this point. However, after it's gone through a number of changes, it does log every single change that's occurred on an invoice to provide transparency around the process. And then in addition, the approval flow is defined when an invoice is submitted. But if you're looking to identify who would be approving a particular invoice based on the chart of accounts, you can go select the approval flow. And this caret above the bolded chart of accounts value will provide the real name of the person approving the invoice. In this case, we are using test users. So this is a test chart of accounts approval. And then we have our back office approval. So at this point, I have covered the different fields and functionalities at the header or document level of the invoice. In this case, if I wanted to change the chart of accounts value, I could certainly come through and do so. Each user is presented with bold values, which are the 10 most recently used values you have selected. Concur has found after a lot of study that each user will tend to select about 10 different chart of accounts values frequently. And if one actually selects this, it will auto select all 4 fields for an end user rather than needing to come through and potentially looking at the entire cost string of entity, company, cost center, and department. So at this point, I'm going to click Save, and you'll see a pop-up that will ask, do you want to copy these values you just selected down into the rest of the invoice? And more than often, the answer is yes. So at this point, I'm going to copy those fields down to my detail level, and we're going to move on to the detail level. So you can see here that we have an expense type, a line description, quantity, unit, price, and total. Very consistent and frequently used items on virtually all invoices. At this point, you can select one or more invoices, or invoice line items, excuse me, and then add items, delete items, edit, or distribute, which we'll get to next. So in this case, I've looked at this and I think contract services service is the incorrect expense type for this charge. So I'm actually going to click edit. You can see that you do have the availability to update quantity and unit price as merited, understanding the total of the invoice, and then the amounts on the line items must be balanced. So at this point, I can come through, I can type ahead, or I can just simply locate the correct expense type, where there are currently 12 pages in your user interface. And at this point, I'm going to go ahead and choose dues and subscriptions because we have a subscription service to formats. At this point, I can click Save. And you'll note that the expense type value and the corresponding account code has been updated in Concur. If you do have a use case and there is cost sharing between departments, you can select one or more items and actually go through and distribute those items. What a distribution is effectively being able to cross-charge between chart of accounts values, if merited. In many configurations, you'll want to work with your accounting folks and your people in AP to ensure that things are coded correctly. And that may, if you note that, that may be one very valid use case to come into actions and unassign an invoice. All right. So at this point, I have validated that the total of my invoice and the line items are in balance. And I want to call out this area just above your entries that say amount remaining to be itemized. When this is 0, that means our invoice total and our line items do balance. And this is a really good indicator to make sure, and a good quality check before you submit. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and click Submit Invoice. And then one will be taken back out to the My Invoices page. The My Invoices page is where you'll be displayed all of the invoices that are in your work queue. So for my second scenario, we're going to walk through a PO associated invoice. And one way to tell you have a PO associated invoice is this match to purchase order and a green check. So I'm going to select the vendor name or any of the attributes in that screen, and that will allow one to drill into an invoice. One of the big differences when you have a PO associated invoice versus a non-PO associated invoice are going to be these 3 tabs: the invoice tab, the purchase order tab, and the matching summary tab. These are important, and we'll get to them in just a moment. You will see a slightly different layout of the invoice header, which will include a populated purchase order number. This value in your purchase order number field is where Concur looks to say this invoice is associated with this purchase order number. The reason I communicate this is if a vendor incorrectly documents a purchase order number on an invoice, you may need to select a different purchase order number by typing it in, a valid PO number in, and clicking save. If you do not see these three tabs, you are working a non-purchase order associated invoice, and you may need to enter that value and click save, in which case Concur will ask you if you would like to associate the invoice with a purchase order. I'll show that in just a few minutes. So again, we have our header fields, we have our line item fields, and there's really no material differences other than these tabs. So since we have a purchase order associated with the invoice, we're going to click on the purchase order tab. And very simply, this provides context and the data points for the purchase orders when it was requisitioned. Additionally, if receipt of goods needs to occur, on this purchase order tab is where you can select enter a receipt of goods number and quantity. As a general rule, one must receive goods before they are allowed to be invoiced. A couple of other nice to haves here are an audit trail for the purchase order, the ability to view associations between invoices and purchase orders. And at this point, I don't need to make any changes because the purchase order has already been called in. I have the goods, and we're more looking at the payables side of things where we need to make sure the vendor is paid in a timely fashion. So moving on from the receipt of goods piece on the purchase order tab, I am going to click the matching summary tab. And this is one of the most useful tabs when working a PO associated document. We can see by the green check that at a document level, there is an association between a PO and an invoice. Additionally, you want to validate that each line item is matched to a purchase order if it's supposed to be. For example, if you have shipping or tax that's not on a purchase order, it may not need to be associated to the PO line. Additionally, if a receipt of goods is required, you will see the receipt matching ID here. In this case, I actually exempted the chlorine bleach pail from a receiving requirement to illustrate this point. So very occasionally, an invoice may come in and the data here is a little mixed up. Maybe it was how the vendor provided. To illustrate a very cool copy function, I'm going to delete these two line items and come back to the matching summary tab. I'm going to select copy items from purchase order. And if I know I received these two items, I can actually just copy them over. And what's going to happen is it will pre-build out these based on what was on the purchase order. We'll cover what to pay attention to in just a moment. Lastly, I just want to call out, you certainly still have the view invoice link. And then if there are multiple shipments of goods and multiple invoices for a purchase order, this last link, view all invoices for this purchase order, can be important because you may be receiving 2, 3, 5, or 8 invoices for large purchase orders. Selecting this will allow you to see every invoice that's been charged against this purchase order. In our use case, there's only one, and you can see the total amount of the purchase order versus the total amount of invoices against that purchase order. And this can be useful to make sure you're not being invoiced twice for particular goods and services. So in closing this, I'm going to come back to the invoice tab and cover just a couple more things. So as I was looking at this document and making sure everything balanced, you can see I have $3 remaining to be itemized. So the 140.45 only amounts to $3 short of that. So 137.45 based on the line items. And as I look at this, I would want to come to the purchase order, and I can see I have 35.83 for one unit and 101.72 for the other. In viewing the invoice, though, I can see the laundry bleach was actually 38.53. And this is exactly why you want to validate the invoice image against the Concur user interface. As good as technology is, things like zeros and eights are the most common characters that get confused for each other, sometimes threes and fives and eights. So at this point, what I would do is drill into the bleach line item, update the unit price to the appropriate amount that's on the invoice, and select save. At this point, my amount remaining to be itemized is 0. I could work through any other checks that I thought were merited based on the invoice, add remittance description, add comments, etc. And at this point, if we were comfortable, we could submit the invoice. Now, back to the use case of, hey, maybe I need to change the purchase order. This is where you would type an alternate purchase order number in and select save. Concur would have a pop-out to say, hey, I found a purchase order and I bet you want to connect these two documents. And if I were to select yes, it would match it up with test PO number 2. You can see, and at this point, I'm going to change it back to test 3 based on our use cases here. And also repopulate the fields that it did not take care of for me. Click save, and then I'll match it back to our correct purchase order. And you can see there were some red exception messages because I had a mismatch in the vendors. Now, the last use case is maybe a purchase order number got put on there and it should not be PO associated. The way to unassociate a document would just simply to be come over here and change it to a non-PO document. This should not happen frequently, but there is sometimes the need to unmatch and rematch a purchase order and an invoice, and I think it's important to articulate how to do that. So at this point, I have all fields populated, my invoice is in balance, and I'm ready to submit. Please note, based on your configuration, this send to purchasing button is not something you're utilizing, but it is something that's core product. For your purposes, you'll really be looking to work and submit, or potentially if there's an on on assign back to accounts. So for our purposes, I'm going to submit the invoice, and I've cleared my work queue down to 2 items. I'm going to be done working in Concur. So generally what I'll do is go back to the home page just to check my work queues, and then select profile and then sign out. This concludes the demonstration, training, and walkthrough of Concur Invoice for LeCom Health. My name is Ben. It's been a pleasure speaking with you today. And at this point, I'm going to stop the recording and field some questions. Thanks so much.